Hey everybody, this is Scott again, doing another quick Ember-CLI tutorial video. Hopefully this one actually is quick, unlike my last one. But what I wanted to specifically go over today was working with Ember Data, and specifically how that fits into Ember.js applications, what it really does for us, because it can be kind of confusing in a lot of the examples out there. Use like fixtures or mock data. So I thought I'd give a really practical example of working with an actual API, how we can take information that might live somewhere else and bring that into our application. So if you look up Ember Data, one of the first things that comes up is this little definition. It's a library for robustly managing model data in Ember.js applications. Ember Data is designed to be agnostic to the underlying persistence mechanism. What that really means is that no matter where our data is coming from, whether it's MongoDB, a JSON API, a REST API, or even directly from a database, when we deal with that data in the front end, it should always look the same, right? So maybe we have data coming from two different sources, but Ember Data is the middleware, right? So it normalizes the data coming in so that we can always access it consistently, no matter what it is. So let's just go through and quickly create an Ember application just to show you what version I'm working on. Again, it's 2.4.2 is kind of the most recent version as of this recording. So if you're watching this down the line and Ember 3's out, most likely some of this stuff has changed. So let's just create a new API test application. So Ember new API test, and this will take a couple minutes. Cool, so once that's finished installing, we can actually just hop into that folder here and just run our server locally, make sure everything's working correctly. So let's go run it on localhost 4200. And we'll see we get our little welcome to Ember app. So if you have questions on kind of how that works, I made a tutorial video on just creating a quick app in Ember-CLI. There's also hundreds of tutorials out there, so if you kind of want to know where this stuff lives, certainly check out other resources for that. Let me just shrink this window down. Cool, so here's our new application. Everything lives in the app folder, as we know, our routes, controllers, components, etc. What we're really focusing on today is our model. So models are kind of the backbone of Ember Data, right? It essentially gives us a class that we can access that, again, normalizes our data. So we kind of have a straight way of accessing this. So let me open a new tab here. And we want to pull in data from an external API. And one of the APIs I'm going to use is from, let me see if I remember, JSON placeholder.typeofcode.com. So really nice examples that you can use. It's such a basic API. We go here, you'll see really simple. We have some posts. Posts are made by users. Each post has an ID, title, etc. If we go to the users table, this would be like the authors of those posts, and then they have some additional information that we're going to be able to pull in. So really simple example to use. It's free if you want to play around with it, lots of different things. We're just going to focus on posts and users for now. So right now, let's start by generating our actual model. So Ember generate model, and we'll call it post. So we'll see there it goes, throws a post.js file in our models folder. It also creates a unit test for us by default. And here is our post. So really simple to start with. Imports model from Ember Data. And here we're actually going to add some attributes to that. So what it does right now is it imports the model class from Ember Data specifically, but we actually want to pull in a couple other things from DS, which is like the superclass of Ember Data. So let's import DS from Ember Data. And one of the things we want to access are adders. So adders, think of it kind of like if we're specifying the type in a database, we would say like integer or string. Kind of the same concept here, just a way for us to tell Ember, what the type is that we're dealing with. And this is actually called transforms. And there's a few default ones: string, number, date. I forget the other one off the top of my head, but you can also create your own, and I'll show you a quick example of that too. So this is accessed through ds.adder, and then we would say string. One of the things I like to do, and if you watch my other video, we kind of go over some of the ES6 syntax. I like to extract that from ds directly. That way I can access it just by calling adder here instead of ds.adder. Kind of saves me a couple keystrokes. I think it also makes it a little easier to read for when people come in. So let's go look at the posts again and kind of see what items we have. So we have user ID, we have an ID, we have a title, and we have a body. So one of the important things to remember with Ember Data is that ID is going to inherently be there. It always wants some sort of unique identifier, and by default it's going to be called ID. So we don't actually have to specify that we have an ID here. Ember Data is going to know that, and that's kind of just the common thing that you're going to see with a lot of APIs. So here we have user ID, title, and body. So let's start with title because that's really simple. We know that's a string. And same with body, so adder, string. Real simple. So the next complicated thing though is we have this user ID, right? And this corresponds to an actual user. So let's go back to this API and look at users. You can see here it's going to relate those IDs to these specific people. So this is actually a separate model entirely, right? So we're going to have this relationship corresponding to our posts. So let's actually create a user model. So same exact thing. We're going to Ember generate a model called user, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to import ds from Ember Data. And we're going to get that adder again. So similarly here, we have a bunch of things we want to bring in. I see name, I see username, email, phone, website. For right now, I'm going to keep it really simple and just do name, email, maybe phone number. Those are all strings. So address, this one's a little more complicated because this is actually an object. And we can create our own custom transform to handle this, but by default, Ember Data doesn't have a way to handle that, right? So that's not one of the default transforms that comes with it. We would actually have to find a way to either serialize that information or create a transform that knows how to handle it correctly. But for the time being, we will just have our name, which is a string, and email, also a string, and let's sure that we'll bring in the phone for some reason, also string, and I think website was another one. So now we have our kind of two models here set up. So we have our users and our posts. We actually want to relate one to the other, and that's another method that DS has. So here, let me break this down to multiple lines again. I just want to make this a little easier to read. We have a belongs to relationship. So posts is going to have a user ID, remember. If we go back here and look at posts real quick, we have a user ID, and that ID belongs to a user. So we can say user ID belongs to, and in this case it's going to be the name of another model we have. So because it's called user, we relate it, and Ember's going to know to relate it directly to this. And what that does for us is just kind of saves us having to write a second request. So when we say, hey, I want to get the post's user, what Ember Data is going to do is it's going to take that ID and it's going to make a GET request to this API and return that specific user. So it kind of just does a lot of this stuff that we were doing manually, making multiple AJAX requests, and just kind of simplifies it for us. So it's not like it's side-loading all this information and it creates this post object that has access to the user inherently. It just says, hey, when you want this information, I'm going to make that second request and get that additional information. So similarly, user ID belongs to user, and a user has many posts. So much like we would create a has many relationship in a database, now we can do has many here. And I like to, in case you didn't notice, have a line break kind of between what's my relationships and what are my adders. So this is something that's actually on my model itself, and up top are the relationships that it has. Really doesn't matter any way you want to do it. I think that just makes it easier to read, so I can kind of make sense of that. Cool. So we have our posts and we have our users. So what I want to do is I want to test this on an actual route. So let's Ember generate a route, and we'll just call it posts. Cool. So let's go to our template. We have our posts here. This has an outlet. I'll render any subroutes there. And I'm just going to add a header here. This is our post route, just so we can know that's where we are. And if I go here and go to /posts, this is our post route. Okay, cool. So this is where I want to render all the information about specific posts, or all the posts in this case. So let's start kind of with broad strokes. Let's grab all the posts that we have and kind of render them here. So let's just close a couple of these tabs here. So how do we get information from our external API into this model, right? Because it doesn't inherently just know about it. And another thing that Ember Data does for us is allows us to create adapters and serializers. So let's go and just create an adapter real quick, and I'll kind of go over what that is. Ember generate adapter post, and this is important to remember because you might think of it in terms of posts, plural. And when you're dealing with adapters, serializers, model, you always want to deal with singular, because Ember is smart enough to know to pluralize that stuff when it makes requests for many versus singular. So always go with singular. Ember will take care of the pluralizing. If you really want to look into that, I forget the term off the top of my head, but there is like an actual library that you can use to kind of go over how to pluralize certain things in certain cases, but certainly out of the scope of this right now. So let's look at our adapter that we just generated. Import application adapter from application. And I actually don't know why it does this by default. I kind of don't like it because we actually don't have an application adapter just yet. So an application adapter is the default behavior that all of our adapters are going to do by default, and we're essentially extending that. And in this case, that's not really what I want to do, right? I actually want to create a fresh adapter. So let's import DS again from Ember Data. And this will be a ds.rest. Oh, all capitals actually, rest adapter. Right, so this is a REST API, and that's what we want to deal with. So what does the adapter do for us? This kind of controls information going out from our app to wherever. And the first thing you want to specify is the host that it's going to go to. So this is going to be the actual namespace. And in this case, it is, switch back here, JSON placeholder.typicode.com. That's it. So that's the host itself. And then past that, we have a path within there, or a namespace essentially, that we want to access. So this is our host, and we want to access the post's path from our host, right? So that's when we say path for type, and we're going to return posts. So path for type is one of the methods on Ember Data's Rust adapter. Just specifies the actual path that we want. And the path itself is the last piece of this. So one of the other things, and we're not going to use it in this example, but say, you know, it was like API version 1 test or whatever. This would be the namespace. So this is the host. This is the namespace, right? So essentially the folders we're going through to access this information, and this is the path. So if we had a namespace, that would be namespace, you know, API/v1/test, whatever. So just kind of remember that if you're dealing with other APIs that have big namespaces like that, you'll definitely certainly need that. So this is kind of it for our actual adapter here. So that takes care of the posts, but we also have the user, right? So the user is going to do the same exact thing. So let's Ember generate adapter user. And we can pretty much just copy this whole thing, paste it right in, except this time it's going to be accessing the users. So one of the first things that you might think, oh, hey, we have repeated code here. That would certainly be the first thing that I would think of. Maybe we actually want to generate kind of a general adapter for all of our type of code API requests. So let's actually do that really, really quick. Adapter type of code. And we come here. So let's paste this in, except we're going to get rid of the path for type, right? So this is essentially just keeping the information for our host. And in this example, it really doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense because there's just not a ton of code here. But if you have an adapter, if you have an API that you have to make a lot of changes to in the adapter itself, it might make sense to kind of make a base adapter and then extend from that. And the reason is you might have things like query for type. You're actually updating the queries that are going out because that API requires information to be queried in a certain way. So rather than making those changes in a bunch of places, let's make it in one adapter and then have all of our adapters just kind of extend from that. So we're just going to keep the host in our type of code adapter. And then in here, we can actually import, we'll call it type of code. We can call it whatever we want. And this will be from the type of code JS file. And then rather than extending type of code, or rather than extending the REST adapter, we're extending type of code here. And now we can get rid of the host. So this adapter now, a little more idiomatic because we're just dealing with the posts, right? We wouldn't think to go to the post adapter and control our whole namespace from there. This kind of just makes a little bit more sense. And here similarly, but this is now users. Cool. So this is our kind of parent adapter. It handles our host, you know, potentially our namespace, anything that we want to kind of trickle down to all of our adapters. And then this is specifically just going out to the posts route, and this is specifically just going out to the users route. Cool. So now let's actually render some of this information on our actual page. So how do we, again, make this request? Well, this is when the model hook comes in. So let's go to our model, or excuse me, our routes, and we have our posts route. So this is where the model hook itself would actually live, and we want to, in this case, return all of the posts that we have, and we're going to render it on our template. So the first thing you always want to do is write the model hook. And this is something that happens implicitly. By default, it's not going to do anything, but we want to return all of the posts that are here, right? And then render a bunch of them. So this is when we access the store. So the store, as you would think, stores all of our information. And it's really nice because it's not going to store, it's not going to go out and make a request as soon as the app starts and store all the information there. It's only going to, you know, access data when it needs to, but it does store it there so that if you do have to access it again, we don't have to make a separate request unless we force it to. So let's return this .store.findAll post. And again, singular here, we're always going to do singular. Ember will take care of pluralizing this information if we want to. And find all does exactly what you think it's going to do. It's going to find all of them. So there's a few methods here that you can use. Right now we're just dealing with find all, but we can query for particular records. We can query record for one in particular, or we can find record, which is when we fetch something by a particular ID. So now we have our model, right? It's going to return all of our posts, and what happens here in the background with Ember is it sets up our controller, and it's going to set this as model, right? And then we'll have model.id.title.body, etc. So let's go into our actual template here and maybe render this information out. So let's go below our little outlet here. So I want to render each post that we have, right? And that's when we can use this each hook, so each model, so for everything in our model, and we'll render this as a post. So while we're in here, let's pull in, let's do a little, we'll do H3 so it's not super big. Post.title. So each item in our model, right? Because our model, because we're using the find all record, it's going to return an array. We're going to iterate over that whole array with each item as a post, and this can be called anything, but since we're dealing with posts, we're going to call them posts, and we're going to render the actual title. So let's save that. So if we look at this right now, and we bring up our console, we're going to see a ton of errors here. So warning encountered 0 in payload, but no model was found for the name 0. And this is super confusing. This confused me a ton when I first started. So what it's looking for when it hits this API is it's trying to match a name here, right, to something specifically in our app. So if we're making a request for posts, it expects something here to be called posts. Otherwise, it doesn't really know if it's getting the right information or not. We know it is. Right? We can clearly look at it and say, all right, we're going to this post route on this API, right? We kind of expect all the information here to be correct, but that's not the way Ember is going to think. So what it wants us to do here is it wants us to normalize the response that's coming to us. And again, this is one of the things that really tripped me up when I first started, especially when you're dealing with a lot of APIs that might return something like results, right? And the results is all the information that we want, but it's going to say, all right, I can't find a model called results. I don't know if this is actually the right information. So this is when we want to serialize the data. So let's generate a serializer, called post. And we're going to hop into our serializers folder. So this is a JSON API serializer by default. We're actually dealing with a REST API. JSON API has really kind of strict standards and a certain type of format. So the type of serializer and adapter that you use really depends on the type of API you're dealing with. So if it is a JSON API, we can use the same exact methods that we're going to use. But just on the back end, kind of Ember serializes it in a different way. So let's just import ds from Ember Data. And then here, this is going to be ds.rest serializer now instead of rest adapter. And what we want to do is we want to normalize our response. So if you look up Ember, normalized response, let's look this method up. Here, you'll see there's actually two methods. There's the private method, and I'm going to go over the differences here versus, the public one. So the one that we can access versus the one that's actually called in the background. So what does normalized response do is used to normalize a payload from the server to JSON API document, or in this case, REST API. This method delegates to more specific blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it does a bunch of stuff. Cool. So what it really does is it takes in a bunch of parameters. In this case, store, primary model class, payload ID, and request type. It does a bunch of stuff with it, right? And then if it's has many requests, or if it's a many requests, it iterates over the array. If it's a single request, it just returns this one particular object. So what we want to focus here on these parameters that are passing through this method anyway, we want to play with the payload. So let's actually just console log the payload. And because we're overriding this method, we actually want to make sure that we don't completely override it. So let's return this.super. So it's going to call the super class is the normal method for this. Take all the arguments that we're coming, just kind of do business as usual. So we're going to do stuff here, and then afterwards keep doing what you were doing, right? So let's look at our logs. Cool, we got a bunch of objects, right? And that's kind of what we thought we were going to get. So the information is coming into our app, right? We got an array of a bunch of objects. That's what we wanted. But again, our app doesn't know what to do with it. So what it expects, again, is it expects to get this huge collection and expects something in this to be called posts, right? That's what it wants it to be. So here, so let's take that payload and we're gonna just say posts payload, right? This is the format it expects. It expects a hash with a posts object that is an array, of our payload. It's going to be an array of a bunch of stuff. Now, some of you might instantly realize kind of what the problem's going to be here and why this isn't going to work instantly. Because if I go here, again, I'm not getting that information that I want back. But if I go and I console log the payload after this, right? That's what I want. This is what it expects it to come back as. Again, a hash with something that corresponds to posts, and the posts is the array that holds all of the objects we want. So why doesn't this work? And this is, again, one of those things that really trip me up, and it's because of this arguments thing. So arguments is this cool, ES6 thing that we can say, all right, take all the arguments that come into our method, no matter how many there are, and then just kind of do business as usual. The issue with that is what arguments is really doing is it's referencing the original item in memory that came into our method. So because we overwrote payload, it's not accessing this new payload, right? It's accessing the original parameters that came in. And this was so confusing to me. So if we use this method, and rather than calling arguments, we just pass all these parameters in again, because we manipulated one of them here, we're going to get the correct response. So again, it's just one of those tricky, like dealing with things in memory versus kind of how things are working locally. One of those caveats to remember. So now we get the payload in a way that Ember Data expects us to, right? It expects a hash with, a posts item in it that's an array that has all of the objects we want. And as you can see now, if we go to our posts route, hey, we got all of our titles. So let's go back to that posts route and render a couple other things within here too. So let's make a paragraph with a post.body. Oops, because that was one of the other things we had, I think. Right, let's go over post model. We had a body and we had a title. And we also had, an author. So let's do another paragraph here. And we'll say it's by post.user ID.name. And instantly you're going to think, well, shouldn't we have to normalize all that information? And you're right. So let's handle fetching the user ID information from our payload. So similarly, we're going to Ember generate another serializer, but this time it's going to be for the user. Ember generate serializer user. And we're going to do same exact thing here that we did previously. So let's actually just copy this whole thing, because again, we're not dealing with a JSON API serializer. We're dealing with DS-REST serializer. So payload users. And that's kind of what it expects it to be. You see we're not getting a bunch of errors now. So again, what it was trying to do is it was trying to look in the payload and it was trying to find something called users, right? Because some APIs return a bunch of information like status codes that we don't necessarily need to persist through our app. So it needs to say, all right, what the hell in this thing is the users, and now we're going to specifically tell it. Cool. So we're iterating over all of our posts. We have the title and we have the relationship to our users. So if you want to kind of see what's happening, just refresh this and you'll see it makes 11 requests. It makes one request for all of the posts, right? That was our find all method. And as I said before, what it did when it relates those, when it relates the author, the user, to those posts, it makes another get request specifically by that ID. So that's what it's doing here. Because we have 10 authors in total, it made 10 total requests. And it didn't have to do that for every single post. That's kind of the benefit, again, of having that store. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to check the store to see if we have an author with an ID of 1. If we don't, we're going to hit the API and we're going to get it. If we do, we're just going to return it from the store because we already have that information. That's one of the nice things that Ember Data is doing for you. It's not making a bunch of unnecessary requests. Typically, sometimes it does, but hey, that's just part of programming. Cool. So we have our users, we have our posts, we're iterating over all of them. If we go back to our actual route here, one of the things that I don't like is that I have to call it model here. And you'll see this a lot, and I just want to show it as an example because you're going to see it in a lot of examples. I want to call this posts. I don't want to call it model, so that's when we do the SetupController hook. So SetupController is a method that's called every time, right? This method is being called whether we write it or not, and all it does is it takes the model and returns it. It essentially makes the model accessible on our view because it sets the model on our controller, and the controller is what controls what's accessible on our template. So what I want to do is I want to ember.set a property on my controller. I want to call it posts, and I want to bind it to model. So this route now, it's going to fail because model is no longer defined because we overwrote the default behavior here. But now I can call this posts. So each post as post, and now we get all this information. So I think this just makes the template a little easier to read, a little more straightforward. So if somebody else comes in here, they're not really confused. I think it's really good to always be specific with the model. Don't just use the word model because it's just not descriptive whatsoever. And again, whoops, I like to do this kind of destructuring here. So rather than saying that, and we can also bring in the route. Again, kind of saving some keystrokes. So we're extending, we destructured Ember to extract the route object and the set method. Cool. So next, that's kind of it in a nutshell, right? Adapter controls our information going out. Serializer serializes the information, normalizes the response. So you can go really crazy in these serializers and these adapters if you want to, and I want to show you a quick example of that. And one of the reasons is because I think if we go to our post here, I don't like that I have to call this user ID. I want to call it user, right? Because that's more descriptive. User belongs to the model user, That's how I'm going to think that I want to access that information. So let's go into that serializer, and when we iterate over things, we want to get back our user ID as something called user, a little more descriptive. So how would we do that? Well, when we iterate over our payload, right, we can say change every key that is, user ID and update it to user. So once we have that, we can say payload.post for each post that we have, and we'll call it post. We're going to do an anonymous function here. I'm going to use arrow functions. And if you're not familiar with that, feel free to kind of look up ES6 syntax. It's just a faster way to write function, but it essentially binds this so we don't lose our current scope. Post.user is now going to be the same as post.userID. And then because I don't need user ID anymore, I'm going to delete post.userID. Cool. So now this stuff's going to fail. It's going to blow up at me, and rightfully so, because now it doesn't know what the hell that stuff is. Oops, and this should be, sorry, that should be post. Singular. Okay, so now we don't have our author, right? Because in our model, we now want to call this user instead of user ID. And that still didn't work. And why did that not work? Because in our template, it's not user ID anymore, it's user. So we got to update it in both places. And we're still, there we go. So that's a little async JavaScript for you. Took slightly longer to load the authors or the user here because, again, it's making those second requests to go and fetch all that information. So that's cool. We took something, our API returned something. We said, we don't like it that way. We want to format it in a way that's more readable. That is when we go into the, that manipulating the payload. So the next thing that I want to show you is how can we get a specific post or specific posts by certain users. And we can kind of break down how we want to do that. So let's Ember generate another route. Let's call this post/user. And because I don't want to render all this information at my parent template, like that information we have with all of the posts, let's put that on our index route. Cool. So now we have our routes, we have our posts, we have our index, and this is where I actually want to do all this stuff. So this is going to happen on my index route now. And similarly, this here, well, actually just this part, is going to happen on this here. So again, just kind of moving things around. Whoops, I don't want to delete the whole file. Cool. So this is now our index route instead of it living at our parent route. And now our parent route doesn't need to do all this. So our child routes are going to handle actually fetching the information. So in this case, what I'm thinking is I'm going to go to the user route, and I'm going to pass in an ID, and that ID is going to be the actual user's ID, right? So give me all the posts for a particular user. And if you want to see this in action, I believe you can just do user ID equals 1. Cool, right? So how do we get this information into query params, right? So similar to before, we're going to have a model hook, and we'll do a SetupController as well. But the first thing we really want to do is we want to edit something on our router. So we need to relay that information that we're fetching for a certain ID, and I want that to live in the URL, right? So I want to go to post/user/1, and I expect that to return all the posts for user 1. So that's when we specify the path in our route. So it's going to be /user still, but I'm passing in an ID now. That's our params, right, that we're going to pass in here. So let's go to our user route here, and now we can have access to the params. And that name in the params is going to map, so params is going to be an object that has an ID. And we can actually, you can pass in tons of params, so you could also do like /user, /slug, whatever information you have there. But we'll keep it really simple for now. So we'll return this .store. So instead of doing find all, now we're going to do query. So we're going to query post, again singular. And then here is where we want to write out what we want to put in our query string. So just like this, we want to follow this format. So again, we don't call it user ID, we call it user, but because we're making the request directly to the API, we kind of have to follow their convention. Because I don't have any control over what the API is returning here. So user ID, and that's going to be our params.id, right? So it's going to return, similar to the find all request, is going to return a bunch of posts, but this time it's only going to be the posts for that particular author, that particular user. And much like here in the index route, I want to do SetupController, because I don't want to have to call it model, I want to call it posts. And similarly, let's just kind of almost steal all this stuff. Cool. So now if we go to our actual users route here, let's render the same exact stuff, right? So it's going to be the same exact information, except it's going to be broken down by user. So if I go to /user, is that what I called it? Yeah, I called it /user/2. So you'll see I'm still getting all those posts, but now I'm only getting posts for this author. And if we go to our network tab here, you'll see that's the request that it made. Posts, query string, user ID = 2. So I mean, it took care of all the AJAX request stuff for us and kind of put it in a really simple to understand way. I want to query for posts. The user ID is this, right? And then it kind of did all that for us. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. One of the other really important things, though, that I want to kind of go over is if we were fetching things by a particular ID, when that would fail. So let's generate a posts show route. Ember generate route post/show. So this is if I want to show a particular route, right? And similarly to this, I want to have a path where now we're fetching just an ID. So this is going to be the ID of the post. So if I go to /posts, I'm going to get all the posts. If I go to /post/1, I expect to get post 1, right? So let's go to our show route here, and let's just steal all this stuff again. But in this case, I'm going to find a record, right? I'm going to find a record of a post. It's going to be params.id. And in this case, I don't have to iterate over all the posts, right? I only have one post. And then similarly here, let's copy just this stuff and put that in our shows template. So again, we have 3 routes here for posts. We have our index route, which is if we just go to our domain /posts. We have the user route, our domain /post /user /that user's ID, give us all the posts for that ID. And now I want to say, I just want to look at one particular post. So post /post ID, right? So let's do that. And now if I go to localhost /post/2, stuff's going to blow up. So post.show params is not defined. Params is not defined because in here, there we go. Payload.posts.forEach is not a function. So what the heck is going on here? And this is one of the, I personally tripped up on this in an actual application that was going out to people. Luckily my QA team caught it. And what's happening here is we overwrote our serializer, right, in a way that was potentially breaking. So normalized response, right, we took the response and we said payload is going to be this object with posts, and that's really what we want. And this is correct. This is correct no matter what type of response we're making. The problem is this part is not correct no matter what type of response we're making. Because when we make a GET request for a particular ID, the API doesn't return an array, right? It returns an object. So if I go to post/1, this is all I get. I didn't get an array. I can't iterate over. I can't say take this one post and go over every object in this array, right? Because it's not an array. So this is going to fail, and that's what it's telling us. Post.show.payload, posts for each is not a function because it isn't. And this is when you want to get into some of the other methods that these serializers have for us. So if you actually look up what normalized response does, so let's look up normalized response in our node modules /Ember Data. This is what we want. So this is the actual method in Ember Data. And one of the things I always tell people, if you're ever confused with something in Ember, just look through the library, right? It's all JavaScript. There's nothing unbelievably crazy that's going on here. But let's actually look up what normalized response does for us. And here it's this big switch case, right, that takes the request type and handles a bunch of different things. So if it's a find record, normalize find record response, query record, normalize query record response. So find all is what we're using, so it's actually calling this method. Interesting. So we could certainly do that. We could just take the request type, say if it's find all, then go over every single one, iterate over it like it's an array. If it's find record, then just change this one property. We don't have to iterate over the whole array. Or we can find these particular methods. So let's actually find this method. So normalize find all responses. What does this actually do? We could certainly overwrite this. But this looks like it just calls another method, right? And it is. It's just an alias for normalize array response. And query record, find record belongs to, which is, again, when we fetch relationships, calls normalize single response. So let's look up normalize single response. So all of these request types and all of these different iterations that it calls boils down to two things. It calls the private normalized response, right? We kind of saw that in the beginning when we looked up normalized response. But it calls it with this Boolean toggled or not. And that toggle, that Boolean is just is single, right? So if it is single, then it knows, hey, we're dealing with an object. We're not dealing with an array. If it's not, then we know we're dealing with an array, right? And we're going to iterate over that. And that's kind of what we want to do. So rather than fetching request types and handling a bunch of different stuff, let's normalize single response and normalize array response. So we can leave this here, right? Because no matter what the response is, we do actually want it to be called posts.payload, right? But we can comment this out, and now we can normalize a single response, and that's also going to have access to all this stuff, right? And here for normalize single response, we want to say payload dot posts plural dot user equals payload user.post.user-id. So we don't obviously have to iterate over every object, we just have one object. Similarly to above, I want to delete, and I want to spell it right, delete payload.post.user-id, because I don't want that information anymore. And then because we want it to keep doing what it's doing after we make this change, return this .super. Just as above, we want to call it with all these, but because we're actually not overriding payload, we actually could use ... arguments, but for the sake of consistency, let's keep it exactly the same. And then because we want to handle the multi-responses, let's normalize array response with all those properties, right? Let's take all this and return this .super, and then all these methods again. So what's really going on here? No matter what the response is, no matter what type of response we're making, we want to tell Ember that, you know, this is our posts. You know, these are the items that we want. But because multi-responses, you know, find all, query, peek all, etc., gives us an array, we want to iterate over the array, and we want to update that user ID to be user, right? Because that was just our way of cleaning the data. We want to make it more reasonable. And then when it's a single response, we just have to overwrite the single response. So let's save all that. And if we go back, now we can hit this route for post/2. We get back just that particular post, because again, we're serializing one particular post that we want. We're getting the author's name correctly, because whether it's an array response, whether it's a single response, we're going to handle that information correctly. Similarly, when we go to the posts route, we get all the posts with all the authors, and then we can also go and search for it by user. And now we get all those posts by the particular user. So that's, you know, pretty much it from top to bottom. We took information that lives somewhere else that we had no control over. We use an adapter to control how we want to make requests go out to that. We took the information that was coming to us in our payload through our serializer. We normalized it by saying, all right, this is you know, these are the posts, these are the users, this is the information that we want to map to our Ember model. Then we said, hey, we're not 100% satisfied with some of this information. We want user ID to actually be called a user because it's more readable, because that's the name of our Ember model. So we went in and actually updated the payload and then returned it and said, okay, now do all that rest of the stuff that you're going to do in the background. And now we can, you know, hit these 3 routes for all posts, particular post, or all posts by a particular user. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Hopefully you found this kind of useful. Again, I thought this was kind of confusing when I first started. Like, how do I get information that lives somewhere else to come into my application? Because again, a lot of examples out there, they're using like JSON mocks or fixture data, and like that's not super handy, because it's like, obviously I can pull in JSON, right, that's living locally, and do whatever I want with it. But this is, again, information that we maybe don't have control over, that, you know, I found kind of interesting. So if you have any questions, definitely leave a comment. Give it a thumbs up or thumbs down. If there's something particularly that was confusing, let me know. I can always, you know, do this again, or hopefully explain it in more detail. So thanks for watching.